Thousands of newly released JFK assassination files have unlocked a secret that's been hidden for decades. And tonight, we're finally going to reveal the truth behind who really killed President Kennedy and why. Don't forget to follow us on social media. Just search for The Michael Braa Show on Insta, Facebook, YouTube, or the KC CBS 47 Plus app. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, an event that profoundly shook the nation and ushered in a new era of distrust in government. Within hours, former Marine Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and named the prime suspect. But just 2 days later, before he could stand trial, Oswald was gunned down on live television by nightclub owner Jack Ruby, leaving the country stunned and silencing the one man who might have explained his motives. In the months that followed, the Warren Commission concluded that Oswald acted alone. But from the beginning, many Americans questioned that verdict, fueling decades of speculation that key facts were being hidden. Allegations ranged from mafia involvement to Cold War enemies, or even rogue elements within our own U.S. government. In response to growing public pressure, Congress passed the JFK Records Act in 1992, requiring all federal agencies, including the CIA, FBI, and Secret Service, to release their JFK-related files within 25 years. When the law's final disclosure deadline arrived in 2017, thousands of records were still being held back, citing national security concerns. But over the next few years, additional documents trickled out, culminating in December 2022 with the release of more than 13,000 records. These included details about CIA surveillance of Oswald and Cold War-era intelligence activities, but they remained heavily redacted. Well, that changed dramatically on March 19, 2025. Under renewed executive pressure, the National Archives published a sweeping release of previously withheld files, totaling more than 63,000 pages, nearly all of them now unredacted. 2 large batches were posted that evening, one at 7 p.m. Eastern, the second just a few hours later. It was, according to experts, the most substantial and transparent disclosure of JFK-related records ever conducted. Today, after decades of incremental progress, the vast majority of known JFK-related records, now exceeding 5 million pages, have finally been made public. Yet even with this level of transparency, many critical questions remain unresolved. Tonight, we're ready to present a bold new theory, one rooted in surveillance failures, institutional motive, and covert activity. It doesn't claim to solve the assassination, but it may explain why, even 60 years later, we still don't have the full truth, and why this tragedy remains one of the most enduring mysteries in modern American history.
Trust. It's hard to get and easy to lose. When the risk of loss is great and people are hurting, who do you trust? How about the people trusted by the biggest names in business, agriculture, and government? Atlanta's Private Investigations, building trust one case at a time.
I'm Michael, founder of Atlanta's Private Investigations. Let's talk. When you need help, your answers are here. Before the latest round of declassifications, the JFK assassination had already become one of the most studied and controversial events in American history. Oswald was a former Marine who defected to the Soviet Union in 1959, only to return in 1962 with a Russian wife and a child. That defection made Oswald the subject of intelligence interests from the start. By 1960, the CIA had opened up what became a lengthy 201 file on Oswald, and by 1963, Oswald was on the radar of multiple agencies due to his pro-Castro activism and suspicious travels. Mostly notable his brief but pivotal stop to Mexico City just 7 weeks before the assassination. During that trip, Oswald contacted the Cuban and Soviet embassies, reportedly seeking transit visas that would allow him to travel through Havana to Moscow. Declassified records confirm that the CIA's Mexico City station intercepted his phone calls to the Soviet embassy, including one conversation with a known KGB officer, a man associated with the KGB's Department for Covert Sabotage and Assassinations. Oswald identified himself by name during those calls. Despite this, neither the CIA nor the FBI informed the Secret Service about Oswald before Kennedy's Dallas visit. Official explanations blamed bureaucratic confusion, interagency mistrust, and errors in communication. But for many observers, this lapse, especially given Oswald's contacts and Cold War backdrop, was difficult to accept as mere incompetence. Earlier releases also revealed another troubling layer. The CIA deliberately withheld certain information from the Warren Commission. Specifically, it kept quiet about multiple covert plots to assassinate Fidel Castro. Decades later, CIA officials acknowledged this concealment and even referred to it as a benign cover-up, supposedly intended to protect unrelated operations. But by choosing not to disclose these activities, the agency added fuel to decades of suspicion, leading many to believe the cover-up wasn't benign at all. Even so, every official inquiry from the Warren Commission to the House Select Committee on Assassinations has ultimately pointed to Oswald as the lone gunman. The official narrative has always described him as an emotionally volatile man driven by ideology and resentment. And while historians have debated the depth of his motives or the thoroughness of the investigations, the core story has held. Oswald, alone, pulled the trigger. But that story has never been enough. The public sensed there was more to Oswald's background, more to the intelligence community's failure, and perhaps more to the crime itself. Now, with the final release of previously redacted files, we move beyond the half-truths and the bureaucratic evasions. Tonight, we'll present a new theory, one that fits the facts, accounts for the failures, and finally provides a framework for understanding what may have really happened that day in Dallas. On March 18, 2025, the JFK assassination investigation reached a historic turning point. That night, the National Archives released a massive 63,400 pages of previously redacted documents, marking the largest single-day disclosure since the inquiry began. But raw documents don't speak for themselves. To make sense of this overwhelming trove, we turn to what we call the mosaic methodology, our investigative framework that treats each document like a tile in a larger puzzle. Alone, a single record might seem insignificant, but viewed in context, patterns begin to emerge, threads that connect people, events, and timelines in ways that not previously understood. Still, even with decades of investigative experience, combing through 63,000 pages manually would be a Herculean task. That's why we rely on Maya, our proprietary AI system. She was developed specifically for high-level investigations. Mia doesn't just extract keywords or summarize content. She maps connections over vast networks of intelligence data. Her algorithm cross-references dates, aliases, operations, and personnel files, scanning for irregularities and clustering related activities from across different agencies and timeframes. What Mia found was extraordinary. She flagged internal contradictions, misalignments in surveillance timelines, and missing context reports that had been accepted at face value for years. She surfaced newly unredacted material that revealed a broader scope of CIA surveillance on Oswald, clarified once murky communications involving Mexico City, and brought to light interagency conflicts that had previously been buried under redactions. More importantly, Mia gave us a way to test theories against evidence. Her outputs didn't drive our conclusions, they challenged them. They forced us to discard weak assumptions and follow only what the facts would support. And what emerged wasn't just a better organized archive. It was a clearer, more coherent account of what really may have happened. This is the story the government didn't tell. And now, at last, it's time you heard it.
Well, sure, I remember it like it was yesterday. I was going through a devastating divorce. That's hard already. Then my ex hid our money and tried to take the kids from me. My attorney suggested I call Atlantis Private Investigations. That was the turning point. Michael and his team got me the proof I needed to get my children back and secure our future.
I'm Michael from Atlantis Private Investigations. Let's talk. When you need help, Your answers are here. As we analyzed the newly released JFK files, what began to take shape wasn't a blueprint for an assassination, but something perhaps even more dangerous. An institutional manipulation of narrative, weaponized through surveillance and ultimately allowed to spiral beyond control. The CIA's attention to Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't casual. Internal records, some redacted for over 60 years, reveal that Oswald was not just observed, but discussed, profiled, and embedded within the framework of U.S. intelligence concerns. All of this had been known in fragments, but what these newly unsealed documents show is how the CIA, while never proven to have plotted a murder, began to shape public and institutional image of Oswald before the first shot was ever fired. Take, for example, the covert activities of CIA-sponsored anti-Castro exile group known as the DRA, the Cuban Student Directed. In August 1963, Oswald had a confrontational encounter with this group in New Orleans. What the public didn't know was that this group was secretly funded and directed by CIA officer George Giannitis. Within 48 hours of JFK's death, that same group publicly linked Oswald to Castro, seeding the narrative of a communist conspiracy, an explosive claim at the height of the Cold War. New documents now confirm that this propaganda push wasn't freelance. It was part of a coordinated effort. Giannitis, who had been recalled years later to serve as the CIA's liaison to congressional investigators, never disclosed his own involvement with the DRE or Oswald. This calculated omission shielded the CIA's role in shaping the post-assassination narrative, and it may have obscured deeper knowledge about Oswald's activities. This was no isolated case. The files show that top CIA officials, including James Angleton and Richard Helms, consistently minimized what the agency knew about Oswald when testifying to investigators. They misled Congress, suppressed evidence, and ensured the public version of events would support the lone gunman theory, no matter what the documents said. The CIA didn't just fail to stop Oswald, they managed the narrative around him both before and after the assassination. Whether out of self-preservation, Cold War strategy, or something more deliberate, they allowed a volatile figure to remain in play, and when tragedy struck, they shaped a story the world would hear.
My attorney suggested I call Atlanta's Private Investigations. That was the turning point. Michael and his team got me the proof I needed to get my children back and secure our future.
I'm Michael from Atlanta's Private Investigations. Let's talk. When you need help, your answers are here.
One of Hollywood's brightest stars was found unresponsive, just months after singing to the president on national TV. Coincidence or cleanup? Stick around. Let's talk about Marilyn. Hey everyone, welcome to Kara's Corner on the Michael Braa Show. Okay, so Michael's doing a deep dive into the JFK case today, and you know I had to bring up the name that always comes to mind when we're talking about him. Marilyn Monroe. Now, Marilyn wasn't just a movie star. She was a symbol of glamour, fame, and mystery in the 1960s. But the thing is, her life ended way too soon. In 1962, she was found unresponsive at her home in LA. And while the headlines tried to wrap it up with a simple explanation, the details just don't sit right with me. Let's start with the timeline. Marilyn had recently performed that now infamous birthday song for JFK. You know the one. And there were whispers everywhere about her being closer with the president than most people knew. Some say she had inside knowledge. Others say she was getting shut out, ghosted by the people at the top after getting too close. And when she was found, the first call wasn't to emergency service. It was to her therapist. Hours went by before anything was officially reported. Plus, things were missing from her house. Phone records and a rumored red diary that supposedly had notes about high-level conversations. All gone. People started asking questions. Was it just bad luck, or was someone trying to control the narrative? Now look, I'm not saying I have answers, but I am saying Marilyn's story might be more than just a tragic ending. It could be the beginning of something bigger, a prelude to what happened to JFK himself. So here's what I want to know. What do you think really happened? Should we do a full episode and let Mia, our AI investigator, take a closer look at her case and see what she finds? Drop your theories, hit the comments, And don't forget to follow for more deep dives. Thank you for joining me on Kara's Corner, and I'll see you guys next time.
As we comb through the newly unredacted JFK files, a disturbing pattern emerged, one that goes beyond passive surveillance or Cold War anxiety. These documents, long hidden behind redactions, expose a series of alarming intelligence failures and misidentifications inside the CIA. Errors that played a direct role in how Lee Harvey Oswald eluded detection at the most critical moment. Perhaps the most startling example comes from the CIA's surveillance of Oswald during his September 1963 visit to Mexico City. Oswald's known attempts to obtain visas at the Cuban and Soviet embassies were already well documented, but newly unredacted memos showed just how badly the CIA mishandled the operation. One of these files, previously blacked out for decades, confirms that the Mexico City station reported photographic and audio surveillance identifying Oswald, but later analysis revealed the man photographed outside the embassies was not Oswald at all. A CIA cable now visible in full states, subject initially identified as Oswald by station surveillance, but subsequent analysis confirms individual in surveillance photos does not match Oswald's physical characteristics. Even more revealing is a fully declassified cable sent on October 10, 1963 from Mexico City to CIA headquarters. It describes Oswald using physical characteristics, height, build, appearance that were later found to be inaccurate. The result? U.S. intelligence was operating on faulty data, potentially tracking the wrong man at a moment when Oswald's movements were most critical. This so-called other Oswald isn't a fringe theory. It's a documented intelligence failure. These mistakes weren't just embarrassing. They reflected a fundamental breakdown in surveillance integrity. At the very time Oswald should have been monitored most closely, the CIA's assets were misidentifying individuals, misreporting characteristics, and sending inaccurate cables to headquarters. Newly unredacted reviews from the mid-1970s shows the CIA's own leadership was deeply concerned about these failures. One internal memo, prepared during congressional inquiry, admitted that CIA officers had not been forthcoming about what the agency knew and when. The review suggests senior officials deliberately minimized Mexico City's surveillance problems when testifying before Congress, possibly to deflect responsibility for missing warning signs. Further supporting this breakdown is a series of tense inter-office communications between CIA headquarters and the Mexico station. One message, now fully legible, critiques the quality of photographic surveillance, stating flatly, "The reliability of identification methods is inadequate and subject to misinterpretation." When taken together, these documents reveal the anatomy of an institutional failure. Oswald wasn't a ghost. He was known, watched, and profiled. But the people responsible for monitoring him were working with flawed information. Rather than staging a final intervention, as some internal planning may have hoped, the CIA's surveillance blunders allowed Oswald to slip through unnoticed until it was far too late. These were not just honest mistakes. They were the product of systematic dysfunction, overconfidence, and willful omissions, elements that combined left America vulnerable to one of the most dramatic events in its history. When we began examining the newly released JFK documents, one of the most difficult and important questions we faced was this: why would the CIA engage in something so risky, so reckless, as manipulating a volatile figure like Lee Harvey Oswald? Contrary to popular belief, the motivation wasn't revenge. There's no verified evidence in these documents that the CIA plotted an outright assassination. What the files do suggest, supported by internal memos, operational plans, and historical context, is a much more complex motive: a desire to regain institutional power, shape national policy, and reassert control over a changing Cold War landscape. First, it's essential to understand the state of the CIA in 1963. Just 2 years earlier, the agency suffered a major political defeat with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. That operation, designed and pushed by CIA leadership, turned into a fiasco. President Kennedy, furious and embarrassment, forced out Director Allen and reportedly told aides he wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Newly unredacted memos confirm what historians had long suspected, that this backlash deeply unsettled the agency. Internal communications from that period, now fully visible, reveal high-level anxiety over the loss of access to the Oval Office, the diminishing budgets, and the increasing oversight. The CIA's operational branches, especially those engaged in covert activity, saw Kennedy as a liability and feared he would curtail their freedom even further. There was also a strategic motive, the Cold War. The CIA had quietly intensified its campaigns against Cuba and the Soviet sphere, often without direct presidential authority. Files declassified in the March 2025 release confirm expanded operations targeting Castro, Soviet agents, and Latin American leftist movements. But those efforts lacked a unifying public justification. Some officials believed a failed but visible act of foreign-linked aggression, like an intercepted assassination attempt, could tip both Kennedy and the American people into supporting broader action against the communist regimes. In this light, Oswald was not seen as a killer to be unleashed, but a figure to be watched, used, perhaps even to create a crisis that could be stopped at just the right moment. It would serve two purposes: reinstate the CIA's reputation by making them the heroes of a narrowly averted disaster, and provide political momentum for renewed Cold War aggression. But internal agency politics also played a role. The new files include canned exchanges between CIA factions competing for influence, particularly between covert operations and intelligence analyst units. There's evidence of friction, turf wars, and jockeying for institutional clout. Some of the operatives involved in the Oswald case, such as George Joandes, were part of programs that saw public validation as a path to internal dominance. What these motivations add up to is a chilling calculus. Not a conspiracy to kill Kennedy, but a strategy to regain power, to justify their operations, to shape the world order from behind the scenes. The tragedy that they misjudged their asset, Oswald, didn't play by the script. And when the operation spiraled beyond their control, they chose to bury their mistakes rather than face the consequence. That decision, concealment, not conspiracy, is what the record clearly reveals. Today, we've taken you on a journey into one of America's most enduring mysteries. We've revisited long-standing evidence, examined newly released government files, and followed the facts wherever they led. Guided by our Mosaic methodology and supported by our investigative AI, Mia, what we're presenting isn't conspiracy for its own sake. It's a well-reasoned possibility, built from newly revealed records and corroborated by historical context. If our interpretation of these facts holds true, then the assassination of President John F. Kennedy may not have stemmed from a deliberate CIA kill order, but from something even more unsettling, a failed manipulation, rooted in institutional ambition that spiraled into a national tragedy. The newly unredacted documents suggest Oswald, unstable, radicalized, and closely watched, may have been viewed not as a threat to eliminate, but as a figure to manage, monitor, and potentially exploit. The theory we've explored tonight is that intelligence officials believed they could allow Oswald's behavior to escalate, then intervene just in time to foil a crisis. The goal? To restore lost political leverage, demonstrate Cold War threats, and reclaim international dominance in an increasing skeptical White House. But if that was the plan, it failed catastrophically. The files now available point to serious surveillance failures, misidentifications in Mexico City, and deliberate omissions in later investigations. Together, they suggest not a murder plot, but a miscalculation, followed by decades of concealment meant to preserve reputations, not uncover truth. Mia, our investigative AI, didn't tell us what to believe. She scanned tens of thousands of pages, highlighted contradictions, and helped us connect overlooked threads. But Mia doesn't draw conclusions. That responsibility falls to us, to examine the patterns, weigh the facts, and above all, resist the urge to jump to certainty where only possibility exists. So tonight, we've laid out a new theory, not as fact, but as a challenge. If we're wrong, prove us wrong. Test our conclusions. Dive into the same records we did. Because if the CIA's manipulation of Oswald truly led to the events of November 22, 1963, it would mean that the greatest tragedy of the 20th century wasn't the result of a grand conspiracy, but of a gamble gone horribly wrong. And if that's true, the real lesson isn't just about history. It's about power, secrecy, and the cost of unchecked ambition. Thank you for joining us. Keep asking questions, keep following the evidence, and above all, keep seeking the truth.
It's a mystery.